As the country gears up to the much-anticipated elections this year, there's growing discontent of the country's state of governance, from the record high levels of unemployment to crime to service delivery. Governance expert Professor Heever believes that President Cyril Ramaphosa has a tough job of restoring the citizens' trust in the country's democracy. Professor Heever joins me now. Prof, good afternoon. Great to speak to you. It's not an easy task for President Cyril Ramaphosa. Sona is 5 days away, the election a few months down the road. What can he tell the people of South Africa that he hasn't already told them?
Well, the difficulty that he has is that people no longer trust what he says in a Sona, that it's actually going to happen, and that there appears to be a disconnect between the policy proposals and then what happens on the ground. So restoring trust really requires that what you say you're going to do ends up happening, and that it happens in a proper way, and that's not what we're seeing to date.
So can the President outline specific strategies to combat corruption and address the electricity crisis? I mean, key factors contributing to democratic dissatisfaction, if you will.
So a lot of the corruption stems from the way in which the procurement systems are structured, the fact that we allow political leadership to contaminate the procurement processes in government, and the way in which appointments effectively directed through the executive of government have effectively become contaminated by corrupt interests. So all of those can be addressed. They're largely structural. But there has been absolutely no attempt to address them. And in fact, the Zondo Commission drew a very clear line between the political appointments and the corruption of the state, and and how the state is captured. So the fact that nothing has been done structurally is very important. And we've also seen that nothing has been done even against the bad apples that were identified. So you can separate these issues between conduct and structure. And there has been no movement on structure, no movement on conduct. And that means that if somebody says they're going to spend 100 billion rand on infrastructure, the question is how much actually ends up on infrastructure and how much ends up in the pockets of corrupt individuals.
Now, I want to draw parallels to the ANC's July 8th statement, because it's a statement given by the head of the ANC, who in this instance is President Cyril Ramaphosa. And come 5 days from now, when Sona comes, he's going to address basically the same fundamental issues. Can we draw a parallel to the two conversations? So the one is the party political statement, and the other is a statement of government. There is a confusion between the two, because it sometimes seems to be people representing the political party actually talking as if they're part of government, which they shouldn't do, and we should basically not tolerate that. But in essence, the party is giving some sort of statement of intent. But the government machinery is what you present, and what it's going to do is what you present at Sona. And the problem has been that things have deteriorated in almost every single area that is the responsibility of this government since last year, the last Sona. And so the question really is, what is he going to say that is going to make a difference? Because we don't believe it anymore. It's got to be stuff that hits the ground. And part of the problem now is that the capability of government has been deteriorating, and the fiscal position of government has been deteriorating with it. And the failure of many of the state entities has had a knock-on effect on South Africa's economic growth, which impacts on government's revenue. So the ability to actually say that you're going to do something substantive to turn things around is reduced. So you're going to have to start to address the things that you've destroyed in order to kind of get things to turn around. And we've got to have confidence that those things are actually going to happen. So logistics systems, we've got a failure of our harbors. We've got a failure of the energy system. We've got a failure of water infrastructure and basic sanitation functions, both distribution and bulk supply. So all of that stuff is the basic bread and butter of government, and it has actually got massively worse over the past 10 years. He's really got to pull something out of a rabbit out of the hat, because right now they're not looking good. So, Prof, let's rewind a little bit and go to the basics, as you've indicated. When President Cyril Ramaphosa is putting together his address, the State of the Nation address, who is he consulting? Now,
his trusted lieutenants, I'd imagine, are obviously the various ministers, and many of those ministers are in critical positions that speak to what the nation is looking for him to say. And if we take a point and question the electricity minister, that obviously is going to be critical. I'd assume that the finance minister has a huge contribution to that. So who are some of the parties that are sitting down with the president in coming up with what hopefully is a plausible address?
Yeah, so it's a combination of advice that would be received, not just the members of the executive, who often don't have, deep knowledge and skills. It's very often the administrations that are advising. And so the leadership, the political leadership, is really meant to enable the administrations to pull their capabilities out and give effective advice. So Sona is not a political, although it links to politics, it's very much talking to the capacity of government. So the advice will come from all arms of government going through to Sona. And the question really is whether they're in a position at this point to give strong advice. But the other advice will come from external stakeholders. So there would be consultation with business, which is an ongoing process. And hopefully with trade union that are not merely the ANC affiliated unions, because there is in fact a very, very broad non-ANC related union structure. And all of these parties and structures have real knowledge about what's going on and what's going wrong, and they would have to be taken into account. I don't know what kind of process the president has structured to date to get to Sona, but really that is about the leadership of a president. It's their job to kind of pull all of this together and make sure that they've got something coherent and feasible and achievable to present at Sona, because this Sona is going to be a real challenge. Because we are in now a situation of fiscal austerity where many of the basic functions of government require new investment, and yet the funds aren't there. And we also have to deal with the fact that they have to make some very, very difficult decisions about how many people have been employed in key positions who do very little in government. And that's part of the money that's crowding out our actual spending on real government functions and structures. That's quite aside from the fact that the procurement allocations are being substantially depleted through corruption.
Professor Alex, now, when the government speaks, or when President Cyril Ramaphosa speaks, there's almost a commonality to the language that's spoken. There's a speaking of one with one voice. But is there robust debate that occurs behind the doors to one establish how practical is the solutions that are being proffered by the president in the State of the Nation address? Are those conversations being had from what you might or might not know?
Yeah, so there would be lots of conversations that are happening. So they might have a technical aspect to them, and they might have a political aspect to them. The problem that gets faced is when you start to have failed in a number of areas, you tend to want to put something sexy out there, but it isn't actually something that can be done, like bullet trains or something like that. And it doesn't actually talk to our actual needs, but it looks sexy in a speech. There should be quite a lot of deliberation about that behind the scenes, and I expect there is. I expect there's some very, very hard conversations happening now about what gets put out, because in the Zuma period, there was a disconnect between what the Minister of Finance presented at the budget speech and what the President presented at Sona. It was like there were two different governments. And the question is, are we going to end up in that position as well? Are we going to have practical solutions that are driving the framework that is then presented by the Minister of Finance as part of the financial plan to enable what was presented at Sona? We've had many years in which key policies have just not been addressed in healthcare, in social security, as well as in housing and infrastructure. All of these areas just don't seem to be hitting the ground, sort of 30 years after 94. So it's a key year to actually show relevance and to show that we've made real gains that are not just lies. Because I'm afraid in the last couple of months, people have been making public statements which just aren't true. And they're going to have to be not only will they be called out, they have to be called out.
Now, Professor, if we look at where we are in 2024, it's the second month of the year. Elections hopefully we get that announcement next week, or potentially going to be in the next 4 months. If they happen in May, it's in the next 4 months. Now, does Sona represent a start button for the government to start addressing certain issues? Or if there are issues to be addressed, surely we should be seeing the change now. I mean, how do you wait till February 8th, for argument's sake, to give an address and say, hey, what, guys, we're waiting for the 8th of February. We've just had the State of the Nation address. Let's start fixing all the problems that we have. Or do we suppose that whatever comes out of Sona is unlikely to happen or unlikely to be effected in 2024?
Yeah, technically there's a change of government. Whatever gets stated at Sona becomes sort of moot after the elections. The question really is, I expect Sona is going to be a combination of trying to address some of the stuff that's not going well, but also have an eye on electioneering. In other words, suggest that this is a government and this is a party that can actually take South Africa forward. And so it's going to have to try and build that picture and connect with the electorate. So I expect it's going to have those two sights on it. The question is really, this government already has had substantial time to put in motion a series of very substantive policies which we haven't really seen. And the question is really whether they're going to have a coherent program that really has only a few months to run. But whatever happens, there's going to be a new government after the elections. There will be a different government. Its configuration is likely to be quite different from what it is now. So there's likely to be a new, a kind of a new trajectory initiated after that, after the election. And so really what we'll hear in Sona is really going to be the picture until the elections. Thereafter, a completely new dynamic will emerge.
Prof, let's put this into context a little. There are a number of potential voters that are essentially waiting for Sona, President Cyril Ramaphosa, to make an address and convince them that in the next 4 months the ANC government will fix many of the things that aren't working. Now, should President Ramaphosa fail to address the concerns of the majority of South Africans, does this put the writing on the wall? I mean, by extension, there has been talk that the ANC may not make 50% come this year's elections. If Sona fails to address many of those issues in a practical sense, do you then get the sense that the ANC is on its way down based purely on that address? Is that how important it is?
Well, I think, I think that the president is going to have an eye on trying to get their potential voter numbers up from what the polls are suggesting, which suggests they're well below 50%, which means we are looking at a coalition government, however it's configured going forward. So the idea of the ANC being the only party calling the shots is going to end after the elections. It doesn't necessarily mean that we will have a healthy coalition going into the post-election period, but it won't be the ANC calling all the shots, most definitely, and it will change the configuration of a lot of things in government. But I think that the president would be wanting to convince people that they are electable at this point in time. But what is difficult, I think a real difficult sell that he's got, is to say that he's going to fix the things that they are responsible for breaking. And, there is a substantial degree of evidence to show that all the things that are failing are things that have failed and have been caused by the ANC itself and its corruption. And so to convince the electorate that an incumbent party that is responsible for all of this is going to turn it all around in the next 12 months is a big ask. And I think a lot of people are seriously disappointed in what the ANC has managed to achieve at this point. So yeah, I expect their numbers to drop. I expect a different configuration. We're going to have a different conversation after May. And the question really is whether we end up with a productive coalition, because I think it's inevitable that we will end up with coalition governments in various provinces and at the national level of government. And that's a new area. And by the way, we shouldn't be worried about this or concerned. This is what our democracy is made for. Parties are meant to be kicked out of power.
This is something that's why we have an election. It's not there to say that there's only one party we should ever be voting for. You've basically got to start selecting parties that do the job. And if you fail to do the job, get out. And that's democracy. Democracy isn't just being allowed to vote for the same party forever.
So let's go back a few years, if ever there was that situation where a State of the Nation address was given and you, Professor, were convinced, and post that address you saw various policies that have been given in the address implemented. Is there such a time that you can recollect?
I think largely before 2007, you would have seen some correlation between what was stated as policy and something that happened. There were incredible disappointments in that period as well. The whole HIV/AIDS strategy was appalling and just outside of what South Africa stood for and its values. However, when you looked at a whole range of areas, if somebody said something was going to happen, it largely did. And so I think there was a big change from 2008, 2009, where stuff just didn't happen anymore. And I think a large part of that is that if you impact on the capabilities of government through the way you govern and the leaders that you appoint into key positions, then you say stuff and something very different happens on the ground, because people who should be driving very complex processes just fail to do so. You've got a collapse of systems at the provincial level, municipal level, and national level in our public entities around government. All of those are very much a function of the party that was in power. They're directly responsible, but I don't believe that was happening to the same extent prior to 2007. So I think that we've got to get back to a situation where the relationship between what people say and the results is narrowed. We've got to hold government to account, and it does mean that our civil service needs to be made competent again, and we have to rein in the sort of concentration of power that we have around members of the executive who are allowed to basically manipulate organizations and administrations for private gain. That has to end, and that's Zondo Commission 101. It's what was identified in immense detail and is not unique to those organizations. It's pretty much a widespread set of practices. The problem now is we've got to get away from the politics, where the politicians are addicted to that kind of conduct and can take advantage of the government structures. We've got to change all of that. If we don't, we will ruin South Africa. So we are going one way if we continue with essentially this kind of capture of state organizations for private gain. They've got to be brought back into the public domain and directed in the public interest. That's the only way you begin to match what people say with results.
Professor, it's always great to hear those insights from you. School of Governance of Wits University, Professor Alex Heever. Thank you for your time.